Welcome to Old Heart Stories. The silence of the mountain was the first thing that truly terrified Elizabeth. It was not the gentle, rolling quiet of the peat fields back home, where the silence was broken by the cry of gulls or the whispered prayers of the wind, but a vast, suffocating void. It was a silence so absolute it felt heavy, pressing down on the small, crude cabin they now shared. She stood by the single pane of glass, already clouded with the frost of a November night, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. She had arrived in Denver 3 days prior, married William 2 days ago in a brief, hurried ceremony performed by a nervous justice of the peace, and then endured the harrowing climb into the peaks. Now she was simply Mrs. William Thorne, standing in a room built of rough-sawn pine, smelling of coal dust, stale coffee, and something she could only identify as stark necessity. William stood across the small hearth, his back to her, meticulously sharpening an axe. The scrape of the whetstone was the only sound permitted in the space, and it felt like a purposeful boundary he drew between them. He was a tall man, wide in the shoulders, with hands that looked permanently stained by earth and calluses. His movements were economical, his focus absolute. He had been nothing but kind since she stepped off the stagecoach, but his kindness was as functional and distant as a sturdy piece of furniture. It offered comfort, but no warmth. "The window is letting cold in, Elizabeth," he murmured, not turning around. His voice was low, deep, and held the flattened vowels of the American interior, a sound still foreign to her ear. She flinched slightly at the sound of her own name, feeling the weight of the new title he had bestowed upon her. I wanted to see the stars, William." He finally paused, setting the axe handle down and wiping his hands on the rough denim of his trousers. When he looked at her, his expression was entirely unreadable. His eyes were the color of slate under shadow. "The stars are clearer here than any place on earth, but you won't feel 'em if you freeze your feet off, lass." He used the word lass, the only word he had spoken since the wedding that held any faint echo of her own world, and it sent a confusing pang through her chest. It sounded misplaced and slightly forced on his tongue. He walked past her without touching her, pulling a heavy bearskin hide from a peg and tossing it over the window. The cabin plunged into a deeper, suffocating darkness, broken only by the orange flicker of the small fire. "We saved the coal," he explained, moving to the fireplace. "Winter is early this year. Gotta make the fuel last." Elizabeth felt a wave of homesickness so profound it was almost paralyzing. She missed the comforting babble of Irish, the shared sorrow, the damp, familiar air. Here, every breath was sharp, every surface rigid, and every word counted. She had exchanged the misery of starvation for the misery of isolation. She had lost everything to the blight: her parents, her younger sister, the small farm. She had crossed an ocean with the last vestiges of hope tucked into her pocket, relying entirely on the few lines of the advertisement. Wife wanted. Practical woman preferred. Hardship expected. Honest living. She had sent her careful reply, written in her neat schoolmistress handwriting, omitting the part about her deep, crippling grief and her inability to truly cook anything beyond simple porridge. She had promised practical companionship. William had offered half his cabin and the security of his name. It was a transaction. Now, sitting on the edge of the cot that served as their bed, a bed which, by unspoken and terrifying agreement, they had yet to share, she folded her hands tightly in her lap. I don't know what you expect of me, William," she whispered, the words sounding small and insignificant against the vastness of the mountains pressing against the wooden walls. He was stirring a thick, savory stew, a mix of dried beans, preserved meat, and wild herbs. He was a surprisingly capable cook for a solitary man. "Expect? He paused the spoon mid-stir. "I expect you to eat the food I put in front of you and mend the holes in my shirts before they get too big. I expect you to be here when I come back from the claim." He turned then, holding her gaze with that steady, disconcerting blankness. "I also expect you to tell me if you need something." "I'm not good at guessing, Elizabeth." It was the most he had spoken to her in a single exchange. She swallowed, feeling the sudden, unpleasant lump in her throat. I need to understand the rhythm of things here. It is all so new. The cold is a different sort of cold. The people—" She trailed off. The few people she had seen in the mining camp, hard-faced men and even harder-faced women, had looked at her with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. She looked too soft, too pale, too freshly scrubbed for this environment. "The rhythm is simple," William said, setting the stew pot over the coals. "The sun rises, we work until it sets. We stay warm. We don't waste anything. You'll learn it. You've survived worse, I reckon." His blunt assessment of her past, gleaned perhaps from the sparse details she had shared in her letters, was unexpectedly painful. Yes, she had survived starvation and grief, but she felt ill-equipped to survive this particular brand of desolate independence. The dinner passed in silence, punctuated by the clinking of spoons against tin plates. The stew was hearty and immediately warmed the chill that had seeped into her bones. She ate slowly, savoring the simple goodness. Later, William carefully prepared the bed. He laid out a thick, coarse wool blanket and pointedly placed a rolled-up pile of blankets and a worn sheepskin directly beside the hearth. "I sleep here," he stated simply, indicating the floor beside the fire. "It's warmer, and I can stoke the coals easily. The bed is yours." Elizabeth felt a strange mix of relief and disappointment, though she would never have admitted the latter. The arrangement confirmed the practical, businesslike nature of their union. She was a companion, a householder, not a wife in the true sense of the word, not yet at least. She watched him settle onto the floor, his large frame fitting perfectly into the space he had allotted himself. He was already half asleep, his breathing deep and even, seemingly unbothered by the rough wool or the hard ground. Elizabeth finally slipped beneath the covers, which smelled faintly of pine needles and William's own clean, earthy scent. The cabin was profoundly dark now, and the silence had returned, thick and palpable. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the small sounds, the popping of the embers, the terrifying howl of the wind outside the reinforced door, and the steady, reassuring breath of the man sleeping a few feet away. She closed her eyes, trying to conjure the image of the green fields of her youth, but all she saw was the endless white expanse of the Rocky Mountains she had glimpsed earlier that day. Beautiful, majestic, and utterly indifferent to human suffering. The first few days were a blur of awkward instruction and failed attempts. William would leave before dawn, often without saying more than, "Coal bin's full," or "Keep the door latched." Elizabeth struggled fiercely against the pervasive cold. The fire required constant maintenance, and she had to learn to handle the heavy iron pots and the unfamiliar American measurements for flour and sugar. She was used to a gentle fire of peat. The raging, hungry fire of pine and coal intimidated her. One afternoon, while trying to hang a wash line near the woodpile, she fumbled the axe William had left for splitting kindling. It slipped from her gloved hand, falling onto her foot. It was a clumsy injury, more bruised than cut, but the pain brought the immediate childish sting of tears. She leaned against the frozen cabin wall, sucking in a painful breath, convinced she had failed spectacularly at the one thing she was meant to do, be useful. She didn't hear William return. He had a way of moving that was utterly silent, born of walking on loose scree and soft earth for decades. "Elizabeth, what is it?" His voice, close to her ear, startled her. She tried quickly to hide her wet cheeks, but her effort was too late. He saw the way she clutched her foot and the discarded axe in the snow. "It's nothing," she insisted, trying to regain her composure. "I was clumsy. The axe—" William didn't scold her. He knelt instantly, shedding his thick work gloves. He took her foot gently into his massive hands, his touch surprising her with its delicacy. He peeled back the thick woolen sock. "It's swollen," he observed clinically, turning the pale skin carefully. "No breaks, thankfully, just bruised deeply. You've got fine bones, Elizabeth. You must be careful with 'em." His observation, that she was fragile, that she was fine-boned, felt like a critique of her ability to survive here, yet his handling was tender. He didn't make her walk inside. Instead, he lifted her easily into his arms. The sudden contact was shocking. She was pressed against the hard, unyielding wall of his chest, and she could smell the clean, dry scent of the high mountain air and the faint mineral scent of gold dust clinging to his shirt. She wrapped her arms instinctively around his neck, utterly mortified, yet finding a strange sense of security in the moment. He carried her into the cabin, placing her gently on the cot. He then fetched a bucket of melted snow, adding a spoonful of Epsom salt he kept for his own aching muscles. "Soak it," he commanded, pushing the bucket gently toward her. "And don't you touch that axe again. I'll split the kindling. Your job is the fire and the food. Stick to the things you can manage." His words were practical, direct, and entirely without malice. It was a clear delineation of labor, acknowledging her limitations while ensuring her safety. It was the first time she felt truly seen by him, not as a wife, but as a living creature in need of care. She watched him walk back to the door, retrieve the axe, and with 3 swift, powerful strokes, turned a thick log into neat piles of kindling. The raw power of him was intimidating, but she recognized now that it was also the source of their survival. "Thank you, William," she whispered, burying her foot in the warm water. He nodded, not meeting her eyes, already setting about stirring the fire. "We're partners, Elizabeth. No need for thanks. If you get hurt, I'm the one who suffers. We must look out for one another." The word partners settled over the small cabin like a blanket of fresh snow. It wasn't the passionate word she might have dreamed of, but it was sturdy. It implied shared hardship and mutual reliance. In the unforgiving heart of the Rockies, partner meant everything. As the dusk settled and the wind began to howl in earnest outside, Elizabeth sat by the fire, her foot feeling better, watching the silent, competent man move around their tiny dwelling. She realized then that the great chasm between them, the distance of culture, language, and grief, might not be filled with grand declarations or fiery romance. It would be filled instead by warm water for a bruised foot, by shared silence over a hearty meal, and by the slow, difficult process of learning to trust the rhythm of partnership in the mountains. This was where their love story, fragile and determined, was beginning to take root. The mountain had been quiet for 3 days, a deceptive stillness that only the truly seasoned inhabitants of the high country knew to mistrust. The air grew brittle, thin, and the light, usually harsh and direct, took on a bruised purple hue. William had been edgy, constantly looking toward the western peaks, where the clouds were stacking like monstrous white fists. "The deep snow is coming, Elizabeth," he'd warned, his voice low as he hammered the last of the wooden stakes tighter around the base of the cabin. "We need every last stick of firewood inside, the kind that holds for hours." She worked beside him now, hauling the rough cedar logs, her hands protected by the thick leather mittens he had insisted she wear. Her movements, once tentative and unsure, had taken on the efficiency of necessity. She no longer thought about the lace collars and soft woolen shawls of her old life. She thought only of the next step, the next log, the heat that meant existence. They had been working until near sundown when the wind shifted. It didn't whistle or moan. It hit the cabin like a physical blow, rattling the single pane of glass in the window. William straightened instantly, his face grim. "That's it. Get inside now, Elizabeth. Do not open that door for anything." He was halfway to the lean-to where their most precious cured meats were stored, a mistake they couldn't afford to lose to scavengers or snow, when the true storm arrived.
It was less a snowfall and more of a vertical wall of ice crystals driven by a gale force that seemed intent on ripping the very pines from their roots. Elizabeth rushed to the door, slamming the heavy bar across it just as the world outside vanished into a howling, blinding chaos.
Her heart hammered against her ribs, but before the fear could paralyze her, she realized William was still out there. She pressed her face against the small window, trying to see, but there was nothing, only white fury, the air thick with frozen grit. She couldn't hear his shouts over the roar. "William!" she cried, a useless sound swallowed instantly by the wind's hunger. She tried to remain calm, remembering his steady rules. Wait it out. Don't panic. The cabin is the strength. But he hadn't made it back. He had only been 20 paces away, perhaps 30, yet the mountain had swallowed him completely. The first 10 minutes were the hardest, a battle between the learned obedience of a frontier partner and the wild, frantic terror of a woman whose anchor was missing. She paced the small room, rubbing her frozen hands, listening to the cabin groan and shudder. Then she heard it, a sound just beneath the wind's high shriek, faint and muffled. Not a shout, but a low, strained thudding, repeated twice, coming from the direction of the lean-to. He was in trouble. He wasn't trapped by snow. He was hurt. Her mind cleared with shocking speed. Grief and fear had taught Elizabeth one brutal lesson. Waiting for disaster to pass was a privilege she could not afford. Survival demanded action. She grabbed the oil lamp and held it aloft, then located the heavy coil of mountain rope William used for securing the sled. She quickly tied one end around her waist in a crude but secure knot. She pulled the thick padded jacket over her wool dress and snatched William's heaviest hat and mitts. With a deep breath, Elizabeth reached for the heavy iron bar on the door. Opening the door was like breaching a dam. A violent burst of snow and frigid air exploded into the cabin, extinguishing the lamp instantly and throwing her against the wall. She gasped, the icy air burning her lungs. She fought her way outside, leaning into the wind, the rope pulling taut behind her. The whiteout was absolute. She couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. She relied entirely on the feel of the ground, the slope toward the lean-to, and the desperate hope that William was close. "William! William!" she screamed, pouring all the fear and necessity she felt into the sound, switching automatically to the louder, guttural Gaelic cry that had served her in the crowded streets of Dublin. She stumbled, falling chest deep into a drift, the cold instantly saturating her skirt. She clawed her way out and kept moving. She finally hit the rough-sawn lumber of the lean-to wall, navigating by touch. The thudding noise was clearer now, a weak, rhythmic scraping. She rounded the corner and saw him. He was half buried in a drift, leaning against the wall, his face pale and contorted, his right leg trapped at a strange angle beneath a fallen beam. It looked like the wind had ripped off a portion of the low roof. He saw her, a shadow in the swirling gray. His eyes, usually guarded and steady, were wide with shock and pain. "Elizabeth, go back! The roof!" he gasped, trying a waver away, but his hand failed him. "Silence," she commanded, the single Irish word, "Cunas," coming out sharp and commanding. She didn't waste time trying to move the beam immediately. Instead, she knelt beside him, checking his head and chest for injuries, her fingers surprisingly steady. "The leg is broken, I think," she whispered, mostly to herself. "We move slow. I need your jacket, William." He looked confused, but the pain and exhaustion had robbed him of resistance. She peeled his heavy, frozen outer layer off, using it to try and pad the pressure point where the beam was pinning him. Then, with a fierce exertion of strength she didn't know she possessed, she heaved against the heavy timber, bracing her feet on the icy ground. The beam shifted, scraping against the wall. William cried out, a raw sound of agony. "I am sorry, my love. I am so sorry," she murmured. The word love escaping her lips naturally for the first time in his presence, a desperate plea to the elements rather than a declaration to him.
She wrenched the beam free. William sagged, moaning softly, half-conscious. Now came the impossible part. She couldn't carry him. She tied the end of the rope around his chest, ensuring it was secure. "You must help me, William, just one step at a time. I cannot carry the man who feeds me, but I can pull my partner."
The sound that finally broke the oppressive silence of deep winter was the trickle, a relentless, hopeful sound of water beginning its downward journey, carving paths through the ice, signaling the long, slow, muddy arrival of spring. Elizabeth stood by the tiny window, the pane still clouded with rime, watching a drop of melting snow slide down the thick, notched logs of the cabin wall. She no longer felt the bone-deep dread the cold had brought. The cabin, once a suffocating cage, now felt like the sturdiest refuge in the world. It smelled permanently of pine smoke, dried herbs, and William. Their initial discomfort, the stiff politeness, the carefully measured space between them, the marriage license that felt like a business ledger, was gone. The mountain had stripped them bare, demanding honesty, demanding reliance. They had learned each other's rhythms not through flowery words, but through the heavy work of survival. She knew the exact moment his muscles would tire when he split wood, and he knew the precise inflection of her voice that meant she was tired of boiling beans and needed a story about his childhood in the Ohio Valley. William was no longer the imposing, silent giant who had met her wagon that frigid autumn day. He was her William, a man whose hands were rougher than any stone, yet whose touch, when it landed on her shoulder or rested on the small of her back, was filled with a staggering tenderness. He was sitting at the hearth now, sharpening his mining pick. The rhythmic shunk-shunk of metal on stone a comforting background beat to her thoughts. He did not look up, but he knew she was watching him. They shared a silence now that required no filling, a deep well of understanding, born not of courtship, but of the crucible. "The creek will be high by next week," he murmured, without pausing his work. "It will be loud then," Elizabeth agreed, turning from the window. The thought of noise, of rushing water, and perhaps the calls of returning mountain birds was a balm to her Irish heart, so long accustomed to the quiet terror of the high altitude. She crossed the small room, her movements slower, more deliberate these past few weeks. William had noticed the change, though he hadn't voiced it. He had started bringing her extra dried apple slices and making certain the milk bucket was always full, treating her with a quiet solicitude that was more eloquent than any declaration of love. It was time to tell him. It was a truth too big, too important to hold inside any longer, especially as the world outside was already bursting with the promise of new life. She sat down opposite him, waiting until he finished running his thumb carefully along the edge of the pickaxe head. He placed the tool on the floor beside him, finally raising his eyes to hers. The firelight caught the warmth in his gaze, a light that had extinguished the lonely blue ice of last year. "William," she began, her voice soft, the softest sound in the cabin. She reached out and took his huge, calloused hand, folding her own smaller hands around it. "The winter tried to steal everything we had, but it only managed to give us something more precious." He waited, steady, knowing instantly that this was not about the gold mine or the cabin supplies. Elizabeth drew a deep breath, a flicker of true, unadulterated happiness shining in her eyes. "When the snow fell heaviest, I thought only of survival. But in the quiet time, in these last weeks, I have realized I am not alone, William. We are three now." The shink-shink was gone, replaced by a perfect stillness. William's expression didn't change quickly. It took a moment for the truth, the staggering, overwhelming weight of the future she was offering him, to sink in. He, a man who had chosen this lonely mountain life precisely because he did not believe he deserved connection or consequence, was going to be a father. His fingers tightened around hers, not with the strength he used to lift a timber beam, but with a fierce, protective tremor.
He leaned forward, searching her face for confirmation, for reality. "A child," he breathed out, the word thick with disbelief and profound wonder. "Another reason to keep the fire going then, Elizabeth." She smiled, a broad, radiant smile that chased the last shadow of grief from her features. "Another reason to make this shack a true home, William, a little voice to chase away the mountain spirits."
He moved from his seat, dropping to his knees before her, gently pressing his head against her stomach, a gesture of quiet worship and binding promise. All the awkwardness was gone. They communicated now in pure emotion. He had built this life for survival, but she had given it meaning. The day came when they could finally throw open the heavy timber door without fear of a fresh blizzard sweeping in. It was May, and though patches of stubborn snow clung to the shadowed northern slopes, the south-facing earth around their cabin was thick with mud and the first tenacious shoots of brine. The air was sharp, smelling of pine needles, wet dirt, and the clear, cold runoff of the melting glacier above. William stood on the small porch he had built, leaning against the sturdy frame, watching Elizabeth. She had changed her heavy woolen skirts for lighter cotton, tied back with a simple apron, and her hair was braided tightly against the damp air. Her body carried the soft curve of their future. She was kneeling near the edge of the clearing, turning over the damp earth with a small trowel. She was preparing the ground for a small garden. Not just potatoes and beans for sustenance, but a few packets of seeds she had insisted on buying in Denver. Crimson poppies and forget-me-nots, flowers for memory and beauty, a touch of Ireland brought to the jagged peaks of Colorado. He watched her work, his heart swelling with a contentment he had never imagined possible during those long, brutal months of isolation. He had married her to share the burdens, but she had transformed the solitude into sanctuary. He walked toward her, sinking down onto his knees beside her in the soft mud. "Are you certain you should be doing this much bending?" he asked, his voice low with concern. She laughed, a bright, clear sound that echoed off the mountainside, the sound of spring itself. "William, I was bending to lift stones for walls back in Ireland when I was 10. This good earth will do me no harm. Besides," she said, looking up at him, her hands still coated in black earth, "we must give the wee one a beautiful world to wake up to. We must show him that life is not just timber and stone, but flowers and sunshine, too." He took one of her muddy hands, examining the strong lines of her palm. He remembered the terrified, freezing woman who had stepped off the stagecoach, a stranger in a land of unforgiving silence. Now she was the anchor of this place, the root from which everything good would grow. "We built this, Elizabeth," he said, not referring to the cabin, but to the life. "Not on a wish or a gentle courtship, but on bedrock, on necessity and work. It is stronger because of it." She leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, both of them looking out at the vast, terrifying, beautiful expanse of the frontier. The mountains, which had been enemies all winter, now seemed like protective giants, holding the world for them. "When I left home, William," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the sharp, hopeful green of a newly emerging pine sapling, "I thought my story was over. I thought my heart was too broken to ever heal. I answered that dreadful advertisement simply to survive. I had no notion that salvation would wear the face of a stern, silent mountain man, or that love would be born not of sunshine, but of the harshest winter we could imagine." He raised her chin, meeting her gaze fully, his own eyes reflecting the stunning clarity of the high mountain light. "It is not a gentle life we have chosen, Elizabeth," he said, "but we face it together." He kissed her, a long, deep promise of a kiss, sealing their true marriage, a union forged in fire and ice, baptized in the hard-earned light of a Colorado spring.
The cold world had given them only a contract, but they had paid for it with grief, effort, and enduring love. The mountains had demanded strength, and they had provided it. Now, as the warm breath of May touched the clearing, they stood ready, two survivors and a promise, facing the wild future, hand in hand, certain that the love they had built, timber by painstaking timber, would sustain them through every season to come. They were home. Please subscribe for more stories from the past.